I asked Murray to give us a wrap-up, go over some of the things about why the Fed is bad, why we need to get rid of it, but also why we shouldn't be. I mean, it seems like when we look at the system as it exists, chances of ever making any changes are virtually minuscule to zero. And Murray's going to tell us why that is not true. Dr. Rothbard.
Free market and hard money people have been called, and in a sense call themselves gloom and doomers. You know, I'm sure you've seen the term. And we're always predicting that things are going to be, everything government does is going to turn out badly. There's going to be inflationary recession, which of course occurred. There's going to be taxes will cripple saving investment. The money supply will keep increasing, and inflation will run away, and so forth and so on. And so, whereas the statists say they're the optimists because they think America's great and all the institutions of the government are great. So in a sense, we're gloom and doomers because we point out the negative consequences of government intervention in all these areas, and money and every other area. On the other hand, there's another aspect to it, and finally, to sort of add to that, if we look at the so-called conspiracy analysis of the Fed, we have powerful capitalist groups, financial groups, allied with the government, doing all these terrible things to us. So it looks as if there might be no hope. It's all sort of inevitably, everything's inevitably going to pot, and we may as well go back to the farm or whatever and forget it. But there's another aspect that we tend to overlook, the optimistic aspect of this whole struggle, so to speak. Because the 20th century is has been, of course, the century of statism. It's the century of genocide. It's the century of several world wars, murder, socialism, all of which are interconnected. Socialism and mass murder go hand in hand. But it's also been something else has happened. Socialism was a new idea. It was really a brand new idea when it first started in the 19th century. Not that statism was a new idea. The statism has been around since the state. But socialism was supposedly a different kind of statism, which would the state would magically disappear by maximizing its power. It was the so-called dialectic. And everybody would be free and happy, and nobody would have to work anymore, and so forth and so on. The so-called communist ideal. And so what's happened, and by the late 19th century, by the turn of the century, most people had accepted this as the ideal. In other words, the argument against socialism by 1900 or so, or 1910, you're right, socialism is great in theory, but it just won't work in practice. It sounds impractical. When that occurred, they really won most of the battle. In other words, the rest was simply time. Because when people accept, and by people I mean intellectuals, the public, whatever, when they accept the view that a certain doctrine is theoretically correct and morally correct, it's only impractical, and it's just a question of time. You can put it into practice, that's all. And so the rest of it was a mop-up operation. When socialism won the theoretical battle, or the battle of ideas, it was almost inevitable it would win the political battle 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, which is exactly what happened. But now we have the good part. That's the bad part. The good part of it is that socialism has been tried, and it turns out to be rotten in practice. Okay, to the extent that I think it's a common quip among economists and also experts on the Soviet Union. There are no Marxists left in the Soviet Union. Period. I mean, there are no Marxist-Leninists from the top down. Nobody believes in this stuff anymore. And it's true, I think, in China, and it's true of Eastern Europe in general. All the socialist countries, which are called communist countries, they're just simply socialist countries, more consistently socialist than some others. And they realize it doesn't work. They realize that pretty early in the game. It doesn't work in practice, and it's probably lousy in theory, for that reason. So. As a matter of fact, during the 1940s and 50s or so, and 60s, when American and Western economists were all socialists and statists, the famous quip was when there were international congresses of economists where people from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe were there, and economists from the West. The famous quip was that the economists from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were all anti-government planning in favor of the free market, and the Western economists were in favor of government planning against the free market. So what's happened, so in other words, socialism is dead from the neck up everywhere, and even in general. And now it's running by institutional momentum. In other words, now the Soviet Union is essentially a bunch of people in power trying to preserve it. So it's a very different kind of, there's no moral, socialism no longer has any moral strength in the world, and certainly in the socialist countries, or ideological strength. So now it's a mop-up operation the other way. In other words, now that socialism has lost a theoretical battle, and moral battle, now it's a question of time. Not that it's going to be easy, but it's really just a question of time before the whole thing withers away, to use the old Marxist term. And since it's been partially doing that, starting in Yugoslavia in 1950, and much of Eastern Europe and in Hungary, it's almost fair to say, it's very difficult to measure it, that there's more free market now in Hungary and Yugoslavia than there is in France or other alleged free world countries. So, as a matter of fact, I was very heartened this spring when I went to Poland in March for a conference. It was a conference held in Poland at the invitation of Polish sociologists and economists and political scientists, directed by a conservative group in England, free market group. And everybody in Poland there, and there was an obvious government agent, the guy who obviously they had a spy on everybody, was running the conference. Every one of the Polish intellectuals there, with no exception, hated the government. Not only the Polish government, but all governments. And this included everybody, a spectrum of opinion from dissident Marxists to libertarians. There's a whole range of opinion. All of them agreed. There was no argument. As a matter of fact, when Anthony Flew, who's a distinguished British philosopher and a very outspoken libertarian and free market person, he opened the conference by attacking government planning and pro-capitalism. Nobody was shocked. Nobody walked out. They just sat there nodding. There was no objection to this, including by the government agent, by the way. So it's very heartwarming to see these people in a very gutsy situation. They're there really under the knife, even more than we are under the IRS and the Fed, and they're very outspoken about it. So. In the Western countries, a similar process is taking place. In other words, just from my own personal experience, when I first became a free market person, a libertarian free market, it was 40 years ago, I think, almost the exact date. And when I first became a free market person, I thought I was the only one in the country. It wasn't true. There were a few others here and there, scattered little pockets of free market people. But no economists were afraid of the free market, no people, no intellectuals, no writers, nothing. As a matter of fact, when I was going to Columbia University, both in college, undergraduate and graduate school, the only differences of opinion were, should you be a Communist Party member or should you be a Social Democrat? In other words, which wing of socialist should you be? Should you slightly early, or should you be a Stalinist or a Trotskyite? That was the permissible range of debate, and that was it. And so when I started sounding off on these things, I was considered either a fascist or a Neanderthal or crazy or some combination of the three. That was, depending on the subjective preferences and mindset of the other person. Well, this has completely changed. I mean, almost all economists were, it wasn't so bad in economics, but almost all economists were socialists of one sort or another. Right, so this has changed tremendously in the last 40 years, and it's visible. I'm sure all the people here have seen it. Nowadays, among economists, I would say at least half the economics profession is free market or thinks they're free market. Not consistently so, but it's a large proportion. The term market is respectable. And socialists and statists have to sort of mumble about it. They have to say, well, under socialism, we'll also have a market. We'll adopt the best features and so forth and so on. This is a tremendous change, and also among the public. And generally, the response I get when I lecture to any circles, whether in universities or public or whatever, radio station, TV or whatever, the old response was, you're crazy, fascist, or a Neanderthal. The current response is, well, I agree with you. I agree with a lot of that, and you're right in theory, but it won't work in practice. In other words, we libertarians are now, free market people, are now precisely where the socialists were in 1900. We've now won the intellectual debate, and even the moral debate. Now the question is the mop-up operation. I'm not saying the mop operation is not difficult. It's now a question of going through as the New Left used to say, the long march through the institutions to get rid of this momentum, or accumulated, I should say, weight of socialist and statist institutions that are now oppress us. And so you can see among the public, even among politicians who reflect, as Roger pointed out just last hour, reflect what they think the voters are worried about, voters' concerns, the voters' attitudes. People who used to say, liberals, for example, alleged liberals, used to say the only solution to all problems is more government. And that was the classic thing, 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. First they look for problems. There's a hangnail problem. Too many people over 50 have hangnails. And the way to cure the problem is a massive federal program to cure all hangnails, treat all hangnails, costing only $20 billion at the start, that sort of thing. You see very little of that anymore. Even liberal politicians want to say, well, gee, we have to be fiscally responsible. The government can't do anything. There are limits and stuff like that. So you have a whole shift in the debate, shift in the terms of argument. Even people who want government to invade everything will say, yeah, we want less government. And so the rhetoric adopted now by most people, by politicians, writers, media people, etc., is sort of free market-ish, at least pay lip service to the free market. In practice, of course, they don't follow it. But the point is, since we won again the theoretical debate, the intellectual debate, the moral debate, in the West as well as in the socialist countries, communist countries. So so things are not that bad. One of the reasons for this shift in opinion is hard reality. In other words, the reality pressures, there can be all sorts of vested interest groups and reasons for people adopting ideological positions. But after a while, if the thing really doesn't work, if it sort of hits you in the face, people begin to drop off and think about it and say, well, gee, maybe this whole thing is wrong, as in the communist countries. The reason why Yugoslavia started shifting toward the free market is not because they read Mises or Hayek or whatever, it's because the thing wasn't working. Everything was falling apart, and they started just in practice going to the free market. And later on, they started reading The Economist and say, yeah, it's right, and accelerating this shift toward a free market, which they haven't, of course, reached yet, but the shift is in that direction. So reality began to hit us in the face. The fact that Keynesians were ruling the roost for 30 or 40 years, promising us full employment without inflation. We the economists can fine-tune the system so we'll have full employment and no inflation. The result, of course, which became evident in the 1973 recession, was that we had unemployment, high unemployment, and inflation at the same time. That was the result of all these great manipulations, the great fine-tuning. Well, it was obvious to everybody then, even to economists, even the Keynesians, it became obvious. The Keynesian establishment, which used to be live high and wide and handsome, sneering at everybody who was not a Keynesian as not being an economist. That's where you read everybody out of the profession. They're not economists, because they're not Keynesian. Even the Keynesians have had it. Not that they've stopped being Keynesian, just they've in a state of profound intellectual puzzlement since about 1973. They're dead from the neck up. And whatever they say is not really Keynesian anymore. I mean, it's just sort of, well, we have to be eclectic. Yes, the money supply is important, and we have to worry about the deficits a little bit, and so forth and so on. They've lost all their old punch, even though no one, of course, has resigned from their high posts. This is one of Rothbard's laws, by the way. I have various sociological laws, which I emit from time to time. One of them is nobody ever resigns. That's the, but even though they haven't resigned from their high posts in politics and the universities and so forth, they're mumbling now. They no longer have the old arrogance of yore. I mean, they're really total state of confusion. So, and the reason why monetarism, for example, became important after 1973 is really political, in the sense that since Keynesianism didn't work, and it was obvious that the money supply was important, well, somebody else must be right. And the interest in monetarism was a direct result of the realization the money supply is really important, despite what the Keynesians had said for 30 or 40 years. So reality, in other words, impinges on the situation. People began to protest about the high taxes, began to protest about the inflation. As Roger said, the political cost became high. And so, and for example, take deregulation, another aspect of this. Deregulation has been on a wave. It started not with Reagan, of course, but with a poor Carter administration, who sort of like a reverse Teflon president. If Reagan is a Teflon president, where nothing bad sticks to him, Carter was a reverse Teflon. Nothing good stuck to him. So it was really Carter who launched the whole deregulation campaign of railroads and trucks and communications. Got no credit for it. and airlines, et cetera. And it was because it began to seep in that this stuff wasn't working, that the regulated industries, even the firms themselves, the long run came in. In other words, in the long run, even monopolists lose and cartelists, because they become so inefficient, they can't sell goods abroad in case of the farm program, et cetera. And so even the monopolists said, okay, let's have deregulation. They didn't fight it with the old fervor. And so now everybody talks about deregulation. Even privatization is beginning, at least becoming a word. It's as far as I'm concerned, the one good thing the Reagan administration has done is at least use the word privatization and at least introduce the concept. Not that they've done much in that direction, but at least the term has now been used, is becoming respectable, and is being used by cities and municipalities and to this larger and larger extent. So what we have then is a mixed situation. We have the bad news is we have the accumulated weight of statism, which is where the effects are getting worse. But the good news is they're becoming evident. As they become evident, people react against it. And the good news is that there's been more and more adoption of at least libertarian and free market ideology among the public. It's confused, it's not consistent, and so forth and so on, but the direction, I think, is there. So the result of this is that things can go two ways, and the more we commit ourselves, and I think this is happening all the time, all of us commit ourselves to advancing the cause of freedom, the more it's going to happen. So in that sense, I'm a long-run optimist, and it's not even so long-run in some cases, where the trend is there, especially with my own personal experience and starting off in a world 40 years ago. Everybody was either a communist or a socialist. There's a big step forward where everybody at least is saying, yes, you're right, but I don't think it will work. It seems a little impractical. Of course, as it's put into effect, it becomes more and more practical. Deregulation was considered impractical 10 years ago. It's not considered. It's now the ruling thing. So my wrap-up on this is that we have, even though there are a lot of gloom and doom aspects, that the overall outlook is very favorable, and it will be more favorable if we all commit ourselves to it. Thank you very much.